Good afternoon. I'm Laura Justice, the Executive Director of the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy here at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. We are so happy to welcome you to our event today. This is a 90-minute event. We will have a very special keynote, followed by an also very special panel of educators here with us at Ohio State University, followed by a 30-minute question and answer so that we can really engage with you. Again, it's great to have so many people joining us, and I encourage you to say hello in the chat box. You can post your name and where you're from and what organization you represent. And periodically, our team will also add some housekeeping items in the chat box. We look forward to today's keynote presenter on building ideal learning environments for children of color. Some of you may remember today's main speaker, Dr. William Jackson, from our symposium on children last year. And Dr. Jackson was such an amazing presenter that we asked him to come back and be with us today. Dr. Jackson is the founder of Village of Wisdom, an organization that is mobilizing a nationwide movement of families to celebrate and protect their children's Black genius. Before Village of Wisdom, Dr. Jackson taught science in Virginia and also Georgia. At 24 years old, he became the highest performing science teacher in his district, but wanted to expand his impact further. So he decided to pursue and complete a PhD in education at the University of North Carolina. While at UNC, Dr. Jackson attracted the attention of consulting firm Frontline Solutions to design learning environments for professional audiences. Dr. Jackson has been awarded the Echoing Green, Camelback Ventures Fellowship, and Education Pioneer Fellowship as important recognitions for his work. We are thrilled to have you here with us today, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing from you, Dr. Jackson. So let me turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate the warm welcomes and excited to be on with y'all today. Somebody messed around and said they were going to give me 45 minutes to speak today. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see if that was a good idea or not. But seriously, just really excited to be with y'all today. And before I jump in, just because I know there's a lot of educators on here, and I know these are really trying times for our world. In our nation, just want to send a lot of love to all the educators, all the people who have been showing up for our young people over the last year or so, and just say thank you from the bottom of my heart for what y'all are doing and how y'all are doing it and holding this nation's children and really investing in the next generation. So just wanted to say thank y'all before I get into it, and anybody who's like engaging with young folks anywhere. Super excited to see a lot of people dropping in, like where they're coming in from and where they're connecting from. Definitely going to encourage folks to keep that same energy throughout this presentation. I got a few times where I'm going to ask for y'all to kind of engage. And so glad y'all are using that chat box and encourage y'all to continue to do so. All right. Well, everybody bear with me a second as I get my screen ready to present. Very strange. All right. I want to be able to see the chat at the same time. All right. Can everybody see my screen? All right, great. Thank you, Ashley. So we're going to talk about protecting Black genius today. That is what I like to talk about. And I'm assuming that's why they wanted me to speak today. So this is what y'all going to get. So just a little bit about me. As folks talked about, I'm an educator, I'm a father and a husband, and I am the chief dreamer of Village of Wisdom. It's an organization that we run here in Durham. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that in a second, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time there right now. I also just want to share with y'all where I'm from. I'm from muggy hot days and summers and honeysuckle plants. I'm from skating rinks and putt-putt courses. I'm from Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. I'm from Black parents, from Black churches, and spaces where I didn't actually experience a lot of Black teachers, not formally, but I had a lot of Black coaches and a lot of Black mentors and a lot of Black male folks that I looked up to when I think about where I'm from. I'm also from baseball fields, small hot gyms, and places of the like. I really like this activity, and it's a practice that was actually introduced to me by a group named Spirit House, which is a Black woman-led group out of Durham, North Carolina here with me. Some amazing folks there. And it's a practice that they offer where they ask people to think about the sights, the smells, the places, the people where we are from. And they introduce this practice, and this is actually how they like to introduce people, so that basically folks can kind of connect with you, so they can have a sense of like who you are, right? Because a lot of times we'll talk about our accolades or like what we do, but I think it's also important to know like what are the things that made us, and I think especially like when we're thinking about early childhood, and we're thinking about educating folks in early childhood, knowing where those kids are from, knowing where their families are from, knowing from, see, somebody says, before I start taking notes frantically, will you be sharing the text of the presentation? I'm not sure what you mean by the text of the presentation, Shelly, but maybe the PowerPoint. Okay, yeah. I will share portions of the PowerPoint. I won't share all of it, but I will share some of the main slides, the ones that kind of talk about like our work. And then we'll also share a lot of resources as well. So appreciate that question, Shelly. Yeah, and you get a recording. Very good point. All right. So again, like the idea with this I'm from thing is just really thinking about how we think about where people are coming from and who they are and how important that is to the education process, and really trying to get students to be able to engage with what we're learning. So that's why I kind of go there. So goals for the day, like I really want to reflect on the biases and external forces that impede successful use of like our Black Genius framework, and just in general, like educating Black children in kind of a culturally affirming way. We're going to talk about the 6 elements that comprise the Black Genius profile, our Black Genius framework. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to kind of apply the Black Genius elements in kind of our education. So we're going to keep on moving. This is just kind of like some details on me. If you're trying to figure out how to email me, there goes my email. I'm not going to leave that up there too long, but our website, if you're trying to get a hold of Village of Wisdom, and then if you want to connect on social media. So I think I've gotten most of like the preamble and all of those detailed things out of the way, and I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. Before I go to that slide, I'll just kind of give y'all a sense of like how we're going to do the next 45 minutes or so. One, I'm not super sure if I'm going to use the whole 45 minutes. I hear there's some like really dope panelists coming after me. And so I want to make sure they got enough space. And I know that there's going to be time for like a discussion in a panel. And a lot of times a good conversation can come there. So I'm hoping to actually come in a little bit closer to 30 minutes, but we'll see how this goes. What I do plan to do is to spend a little bit of time just talking about like frameworks and mental frameworks and kind of the cognitive science behind learning. That'll be like the first portion of this conversation. Then the second portion, giving you that framework, then we'll talk about like the Black Genius profile and how it is a reaction to that particular framework. And then finally, we'll talk about like the application of the Black Genius profile. So those are kind of the 3 places where I'm gonna try to use our time today. And that might work out in such a way where we're doing kind of like 3 15-minute blocks, but it might be a little bit closer to 10. Hopefully that sounds cool. And if not, y'all are on the ride anyway. All right, so this is a real question that I'm hoping that y'all can engage with me. What you'll notice here is that there's a lake and some fish, and I have a 4-year-old daughter. And as I kind of do this presentation more and more, she gets older and older. But I want y'all to imagine, for a second that you're walking with a young child and you walk up to a lake and you notice that there's a lot of dead fish in the lake. And at that point in time, if you got a 4-year-old, which I think one might imagine, especially since we got a lot of early childhood educators on here, the child might ask, like, what's wrong with the fish? Why are the fish dead? And my question to y'all is, that's a good question. That's a lot of fish to be dead. What would be your answer? I'm wondering if folks can drop that in the chat real quick. The water. Environment, water issue, toxins in the water, water may not be healthy. Water, environment, toxic environment, water and caught and release, neither. Someone managing the water, people who pollute the water, lack of resources, might be humans' fault. People, because water's not healthy, both. Let's investigate. Oh, we got a let's investigate, Hope. Okay, illness. All right. I don't know. We could look at that, all of these things. Do fish have free will? All right. So I think most of y'all kind of got the point, right? Like if you see a lot of fish that are dead like this, most likely the reasonable conclusion is that there's most likely something in the water that's made them sick. Unfortunately, what happens a lot in our country and in the work that we do, a lot of times we see folks blaming fish for dead water. And what I mean by that is that we see a lot of people introducing interventions and programs and stuff like that to fix youth, to fix human beings, right? As opposed to looking at the environments that are leading to a lack of performance. And a lot of times when we say environments, I think, especially when we start talking about Black and brown children, maybe your mind is going to their home environment. I'm actually talking about the learning environment that is actually happening inside of schools and learning spaces, especially if we think about the fish's health being synonymous to the Black child's academic performance or their learning inside of an early childhood center or education system, right? So are we looking for approaches that are leading to us trying to fix Black children? Or are we looking at approaches that are looking to clean the water in terms of their learning environments so that they can better access the education that we're having them go after? And so some folks might be asking, the question, well, what is something that actually dirties the water, right? Like, how do we dirty the water or the learning environment of a Black child? And I think the key question to ask there is what is learning, right? Like, if we don't know what learning is, then it's going to be really difficult to have this conversation about how we might be impeding a Black child's like ability to perform in a particular place, especially education wise. And so I'm just take a quick second right here to talk about like what is learning, right? And learning really is the process of connecting new information to prior knowledge. And what I mean by that is that we take in new information like a number or the way to turn on a car or how to tie our shoes, and we connect that new information to prior knowledge, to things that we already know. And if we want learning to occur, there's also two other conditions that have to be present, right? One is that we have to attend to or focus on the particular learning, right? So if we aren't attending to the information that's coming in, then we can't learn it. If I'm talking right now and you're not listening to me and you don't know what learning is, then that means that you're not going to be able to take this new information that I'm giving to you, right? So attention is necessary. And then motivation is necessary, right? Like, not only do we have to attend to that thing, but we have to actually have enough energy going on in our brain to want to attach that new information to prior knowledge. But the other thing that's really important to recognize here is that if the person who is helping to facilitate learning is not thinking about the prior knowledge of the learner, then they might be introducing information in such a way that makes it difficult for the learner to connect their prior knowledge to new information. And so when we start to think back to this idea of the fish in the water, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we impeding children's ability to leverage the prior knowledge that they have? Because if we impede their ability to leverage the prior knowledge that they have, then they can't learn. If we impede their ability to focus or attend to what we're learning, right, then they can't learn. If we undercut their motivation for learning, then they will not be able to learn, right? And if we aren't producing, and if we aren't adding any new information, obviously they can't learn. So all of these things are essential, right, to the cognitive kind of infrastructure of the brain for that stuff to happen, right? And so when we think about dirtying the water, we have to think about, are there ways that the learning environments that we are creating might be blocking these things? And a big part of what I'm going to be talking about right early on is that racism unfortunately introduces a lot of challenges to this, to the actual learning mechanism, right? Like, I'm not talking about necessarily what's happening outside of the classroom. I'm not talking about what's happening inside of people's homes. I'm talking about like racism impacts how we have interpersonal conversations and interpersonal communications, and also the information that we present, and that can block things. So what does that look like, right? Those are a lot of words, Will. Like, please tell me what you mean and what you're trying to say. Okay, fair enough. So I'll just say real quick, you know, Village of Wisdom is like this organization where we work with families, right? We develop tools and resources that help parents, teachers, and students to create like ideal learning environments. And a lot of our work early on was having conversations with Black parents about how they were going to prepare their kids for discrimination. That's important just to give you some context, so you'll kind of know like where a lot of my examples come from. It comes from us working with Black families. And so when I think about this idea of dirtying the water, I just want to tell y'all about one of the first conversations I had with a Black student when we were doing this workshop work, right? So I'm sitting in this room, right? And we've come to the end of like our series of workshops. I've been meeting with these Black parents for like 5 or 6 weeks now. I asked, we actually arranged for the students to be a part of this conversation with the parents. And I asked the young folks like, well, what is it that you want to know about Black history? And this young man stood up and said, I want to know who came up with the idea that Black people are less than. Now, I'm going to tie this back to the infographic that I showed y'all initially about learning. And I'm going to ask y'all this question. Does this impede, if he's worried about who came up with the idea that Black people are less than, what is this interrupting? Is it interrupting his prior knowledge? Is it interrupting his motivation? Or is it interrupting his attention? All of it, somebody said. What else? Heck yes, all of it. Attention and motivation. I really like the attention one, right? Because if he's worried about somebody coming up with an idea that he is less than, then he cannot attend to what is being learned, right? And I think y'all are also right that the motivation part is difficult too, because it's difficult when you believe that a certain group of people don't even want you to participate in something, right? So like it is gonna impact his motivation, right? But definitely the attention piece is kind of like the prime culprit here, right? Like racism in that particular way, in this kind of original sin way of somebody creating this idea of white supremacy to make other people feel, not necessarily to make other people feel less than, but really to kind of remove competition. That was ultimately going to impact education in a certain way where Black children have to be don't have to be, but often find themselves thinking about this idea, right? That has nothing to do with what they're actually learning, right? And so now their attention is focused on something that other kids don't have to attend to. And a lot of times I think we miss this when we talk about the achievement gap and other issues and why kids don't perform. They don't perform a lot of times because they're worried about this idea that somebody else thinks that they're less than. And that isn't fair. And we have to do our work to make sure that we're creating learning environments that at least help kids forget that momentarily. But we also have to be careful not to blame children for thinking about that, because they're not the ones who created this lie in the first place. And I think a big part of the reason why Wesley wanted to know the like how this was created, because he wanted to know how to avoid it and potentially how to change it, right? So what's another reason why, right? Black children often the things that are impacting Black children's performance. Oftentimes, what we're talking about is that Black children are sitting in classroom where the people who are giving them information and who are creating knowledge do not look like them. Now, I know there's probably a lot of white women teachers on this call, and this is not to to bash y'all. What I am trying to kind of communicate is how does this impact what kids are trying to learn and what is happening. What we see oftentimes is that these teachers, right, do not necessarily share the same cultural backgrounds as the children that they are teaching. So what does that mean? That means that it is necessary for these teachers to do a lot of work, right, to understand the prior knowledge that these children are bringing to the classroom. Because remember, if I don't spend a lot of time trying to understand the prior knowledge that children are bringing to the classroom, then I'm not going to be able to make those connections to their experiences. And so we talk about this in racial ways, but really this is a cultural phenomenon. White folks tend to participate in what we can call white culture, right? Black folks tend to participate in Black culture. But the more time you spend exposed to a particular culture, the more time you will probably be aware of the prior knowledge that that culture and those kids from that culture bring to the classroom. The other thing that's important to point out here is that the more time, it also matters where the culture is, right? So like we're talking about a culture that is specific to a particular area. The culture here in Durham, North Carolina, where I am at, is very Black, but it is also different than the culture that we experience as a Black American culture in the Atlanta metro area of Georgia, or probably even there in Ohio, where a lot of folks are kind of calling in from today. The other thing that we frequently see happen is I feel like impeding like people's ability to do this stuff is like we put up these types of signs inside of our classrooms, right? Where we'll say like the most influential mathematicians in history or the best engineers or whatever, right? And we introduce these people and we have a whole bunch of Black and brown kids in these classrooms, and then they look to see who has been the inventor, who has been the scientist, who has been the whatever. And then we wonder why kids aren't necessarily participating. And so then again, I ask this question, right? Is like, which of the learning mechanisms is a poster like this going to interrupt, right? It's going to interrupt probably motivation, right? Because I don't see myself in this particular picture. And that's a big one, right? If it's interrupting motivation, then that's going to be a problem, right? So again, the reason why I'm explaining this stuff is that a lot of times I feel like when we talk about culturally responsive teaching or culturally affirming teaching, people think it's like all about culture and it's a nice thing to have to make kids feel good. My argument is that if we don't do this, we actually interrupt the learning process for children. And if we're interrupting the learning process for children, the question has to become, are we even educating at that point? Or what is the purpose of our education? The other thing that we see a lot, right, is that our class rules also oftentimes dehumanize the children that are coming, right? So we see a lot of stuff where kids are being kicked out of classrooms because folks don't like the hair that they're bringing into the classroom. Kids are being kicked out of the classrooms, are told to not necessarily speak a different way, right? Because we want them to speak properly. And this is a really interesting conversation to have with really young children. But one of the things that I want folks to kind of hold for yourself, right, is that when you have this unnuanced conversation about what it means to speak right versus wrong, what you are also doing is oftentimes you are telling that child that the language of their home is not of value, right? Or is a poor language, or is a not right language. And what does that interrupt when we think about that? Does that interrupt the motivation of the child? Does that interrupt the prior knowledge of the child? Or does that interrupt I don't forgot the other one on there? But like, so when we think about those three pieces, right, which one do we see that interrupting? And I'll just pause. Motivation, attention, prior knowledge. Yeah, all of those, their sense of worth, exactly. And so in particular, it also interrupts their prior knowledge. And I just want to point out how it interrupts their prior knowledge. It interrupts their prior knowledge because their prior knowledge sits in and rests in their culture. So if we erase the culture of the child and we tell them that their culture is not valuable when they come to the classroom, then how are they supposed to be able to reach back into their prior knowledge to make connections to new information? So we have to be really, really careful about how we have these conversations with children. If you want to have a conversation about like, well, how a child is showing up and what language looks like and all that other stuff, I think we need to be very sensitive to say that, hey, we use a different type of language here, right? We use a different type of conversation here. There's nothing wrong with the conversation that you have. It is not wrong. It is not right. It is just different, right? And so I think it's really important for us, even early on, to be very, very specific about how we're talking about language, culture, and all of these things. And we also have to allow space for that stuff to come into the classroom, because again, you cannot learn without prior knowledge. And if you can't learn without prior knowledge, then you're not going to be able to make the kind of connections that you need to actually have meaningful learning. And I see a lot of people are dropping a lot of knowledge in the chat, so I would encourage y'all to continue to do so. So again, right, we saw the different ways that a lot of this stuff shows up, right? Like if we want kids to make connections of new information or prior knowledge, then we can't interrupt their attention, we can't interrupt their motivation, and we definitely have to allow them to leverage their prior knowledge in order to do this. And so what we want to make sure to do is we want to make sure that we accept the Black child, right? And we accept their family and their culture in the classroom. Because if we find ourselves creating an oppositional classroom to that particular child's culture, then that child is going to take a stance of being oppositional, right? There was this research kind of done 20 years ago that was like talking about like, Black children being oppositional to the classroom. No, that wasn't the case. The case is that the classroom was created to be oppositional to Black children. And then folks were wondering why they were having this reaction to the classroom. Again, it is more about the water and how we are creating a culturally affirming climate, right? A culturally affirming learning environment for these kids to like really grow and thrive in, as opposed to trying to fix the child, right? Because if we try to fix the child, then what will happen is we will have that child trying to reject their prior knowledge, or we will be threatening that child's motivation or their attention. And so that's kind of the question that, I kind of leave y'all with, right? And I think the question as we begin to kind of transition into the next phase of this conversation is, what are some of the ways that you've contributed, right, to dirtying the water? What are some of the ways that maybe you've blamed the fish for dying, right? For things that actually, that was something where I was trying to fix the fish, because we have to move away from these fixed fishing, these fish fixing kind of strategies, and more into strategies that are providing clean water and cleaning the water. And so I'll give folks just a little bit of time just to reflect as they kind of think about that, because I think it is important for us to sit with this, and I'll model this, right, like, because I try to make sure that folks, like, I think we need more social justice humility, and that is not that I don't think folks should be held accountable. I just think that we should model like some of our own journeys, and to understand that, like, being socially aware or being social justice minded does not mean that we aren't on a journey and we're all working towards that. So one of the ways that I did this, right, while I was a teacher in high school and middle school classrooms, is that I oftentimes would tell kids that they can't talk like that in my classroom. I would tell them, that's not, the language of success or whatever, right? And if I could go back and have a conversation with myself, then, I would really ask myself, like, why are you doing this? What are you trying to accomplish with this conversation? And I get that I was trying to prepare children for experiences that they will have down the road, but we really have to begin to ask ourselves how we can have those conversations in more robust ways. Yeah, and I see people are dropping good stuff in the chat again. So as I give folks some time to think about this, right? I'll just kind of reiterate this statement to say that, like, it is important to think about and understand what learning is, right? Because if we don't know what learning is, then we can't actually help children to better learn. And so I just really ask folks to think about that framework and ask yourself how you're creating learning environments that are really going to allow children to tap into their prior knowledge and make those connections to new information. Y'all, excuse me for 2 seconds while I, as folks are reflecting, and I make a quick adjustment real quick. Y'all continue to make those connections. Sorry about that, y'all. The one thing about giving a longer talk is that you forget how much you need to be attentive for that long. All right, so I am going to share my screen again and jump back in here. Let me start my video and get this popping. Cool. All right, so hopefully y'all see the question here. And as we move into this next piece, right, and we start to think about culturally affirming learning and using the Black Genius profile and get to the meat of this conversation, I want y'all to think about this question here. And I'll actually give y'all a couple of seconds to think about this question on your own, and you can feel free to drop those in the chat. I'll do my best to try to make some connections to these as we go throughout. So I want you to think back to the best learning experience you've ever had. And what were the common themes? What role did the person guiding your learning play in that process? And so what I want you to think about here, right, is that it doesn't have to be a learning experience that happened in a formal classroom, right? It doesn't have to be a formal education experience. This could be any type of learning experience that you had. And I just want y'all to think about that for a second, right? Like, what was it? What was going on? What were you learning about? just give us a couple of like sentences about the learning experience that you had, and would love for a few folks to kind of share. And I'll give us maybe like 2 or 3 minutes to see what people write in the chat. And it was hands-on, child directed. Okay, cool. Learn. People said I control what I learn. Best learning experiences were where my strengths were focused on and not my weaknesses. Consider how teaching someone how to code switch might be part of the problem. What are you really trying to say doing when you teach them that? Yes, this is a very good point, Zeta, you brought back to the thing, and we're going to get to this code switching thing in a second. That's why I didn't spend a lot of time on it yet. Best learning experience I've had is play-based nature and inclusive, connection with the teacher, voice and choice. Themes I felt heard, hands-on and meaningful, non-lecture, teacher connections, respect, theme. Okay, all of this stuff is really good. Culturally competent versus culturally humble. Yeah, so just I'll continue to kind of encourage people to add that stuff in the chat, right? Like I think it is important for us to think about where learning has worked well and figure out like how that maps. And what I also want y'all to do is like hold on to some of these pieces, right? The relationship focused piece, the what mattered in your life piece, as we move into the Black Genius framework, and see if you see connections between what people have shared and what you shared and the Black Genius profile. Because again, just to situate this, right, and to make sure that I'm making this like painfully clear, we came up with the Black Genius profile and the elements in reaction to what I just explained to y'all in the first piece, which is that Black children were experiencing a lot of culturally unaffirming classrooms. They're experiencing a lot of racial discrimination in classrooms. And so we were trying to come up with a framework that would respect the cognitive kind of science of everything and also like allow for folks to actually have this like culturally affirming experience. All right, so if you're wondering like who our experts are, they were Black parents. These are the educational experts that we learned from and that we pulled the Black Genius framework from. And so one of the things that was really interesting early on was that when we started having these workshop experiences with parents, they would say to us and me kind of over and over again, when they talked about the type of learning environment that they wanted a learning environment where their child was, well, these are actually the things they complained about. They would say that the child wasn't interested in what was going on. They would say that there wasn't enough Black history that was happening inside of that classroom. And they would say that their child didn't really trust what was happening, or didn't really trust the teachers. And that was important to us because, I mean, we just heard folks say this over and over again. And for folks who like may have dealt with Black parents or know Black parents or know Black kids, I think it's important for y'all to know that this is like something that happens all the time. I talk to Black parents all the time. All the time, I kind of see the head nods when I bring this stuff up. And so what was interesting to me, right, like as I thought about this stuff was that like we were hearing this Black parent wisdom, but I knew that Black parents weren't being heard in the schools that they were in, right? Like I knew that they weren't necessarily, people didn't see them in what they were saying as wisdom. But what I also knew, because I was in a PhD program at the same time, is that the research literature really was in a conversation with these Black parents. I don't think the research literature knew it, and I don't think a lot of people knew it because I didn't see a lot of people making these connections. But what I saw is that there was a lot of things that Black parents were saying that was kind of reflected in the research literature. Specifically, like a lot of y'all have noticed, and I think isn't a big surprise when we think about the idea of like being able to attend to something and be motivated by it. If you're learning about something that you're not interested in, it is difficult for you to muster the type of energy, right, to sustain a learning task. So if we're thinking about young children, if I'm trying to get my daughter to do a puzzle, part of the thing is that I need to pick a puzzle that she likes the characters in, right? Because she's going to need to be interested in this thing, especially if the puzzle I'm asking her to do is kind of difficult. If it's a puzzle of like some characters that she's not interested in, then that's not going to work super well, right? But there's researchers who talk about this. It's DC and Ryan and the self-determination theory. And so a lot of times when we think about Black parents and we hear them saying like, well, my child isn't interested in that stuff, I think the racial bias in our minds might say like, well, we're not, these children in those families aren't worthy of us respecting their interests. And that's the implicit bias, right? So we really have to lift that up and say like, okay, like, are we actually going to teach to these kids? Then the other thing that we see here is like talking about Black history, right? So like Black parents would say like there's not enough Black history. So there's a lot of research that talks about like identity affirmation, specifically making Black children feel good about their Blackness helps them be more resilient to experiences with discrimination. It helps them build a healthier sense of identity. And we know that like a healthier sense of identity is tied to a lot of better socio-emotional outcomes, in addition to them having better learning outcomes. And a big reason why is, again, right, like attention is a part of learning, and our identity can be distracting to us, right? Especially if our identity is causing us angst because we're experiencing discrimination. And then finally, and this isn't all of them, but I'm just kind of making these like ties, right? Is that Brene Brown talks a lot about the power of vulnerability. And three things stick out to me when Brene Brown talks about the power of vulnerability. She talks about the ability to love, to create, and to learn. Learning in and of itself is a very vulnerable process, right? It is asking us to extend ourselves. It is often asking us to fail. It is often asking us to make guesses and hypotheses that we're not super clear about. And so if we're asking Black children to learn in environments where they can't trust the teacher, then we're really asking Black children to do something that we know humans don't do super well, which is if I'm not in an environment where I can trust the people in there, then I can't necessarily be vulnerable in that space. And if I can't be vulnerable in that space, not only can I not learn, but I can't love and I can't create. And if I'm thinking about like what Black children need and like what Black children and who they are, like definitely we need Black children who know how to love. And definitely we need Black children who know how to create, because when we talk about the Black genius, right, ultimately what we mean by Black genius is this ability to create new systems of equity and justice, right? And if we have Black children learning in classrooms where they can't love and create, then they definitely can't create new systems of equity and justice that they deserve. So we saw Black parents again kind of bringing these things up, and we're like, well, all we really need to do here is actually kind of put this stuff together, right? Like we need to be able to make these connections of Black parent wisdom connected to the research literature, and we came up with the Black Genius Framework for cultural affirmation. So again, this is not a fish fixing kind of framework. This is a framework to clean the water. What are the conditions we need to make it so that Black children are able to access a learning environment that really cultivates and grows their genius? And so just as a kind of like a quick stop, right? When we talk about culturally affirming, we're pulling from basically the culturally relevant pedagogy. So Gloria Ladson Billings wrote a 1996 paper that really talks about this. And, in that paper, she highlighted high expectations and academic rigor as a part of culturally relevant pedagogy. She talked about cultural competence and cultural humility. She also talked about creating like a socio-political and critical consciousness. Other things that are kind of associated when we talk about culturally affirming is obviously the positive racial socialization and creating authentic relationships. Like these are all pieces of when we say culturally affirming, this is what we mean, and this is like where that information comes from. And so you might be asking yourself, like, before I get into the framework and how this, like, what does this mean? So we've done a study, and basically, the study was out kind of outside of like the range of, I guess, a lot of people on this call, but we did it with folks who are 7th grade and up. And so what we saw is that across the 6 Black genius elements that we have identified, is that when students rated this as higher, they were more likely to attend the schools, they were less likely to experience suspensions, and their academic performance was increased, right? So like, again, back to this idea of, if we're talking about models that center learning, right, and what learning is, right, and they are also culturally responsive, it's not a surprise that we would see this type of academic performance gain, because we're tying into the cognitive mechanisms of how learning works when we think about like our Black genius our Black genius like profile. So at this point, at 20 plus points in, hopefully folks are kind of thinking like, well, how do I access this Black Genius Plan tool? Like, how does it work? So what folks can do is that if you go to blackgenius.com or if you go to villageofwisdom.org, you should be able to navigate to a page that says like Black Genius Planning or Black Genius Profile. And I'll see if I can kind of drop the link. If anybody sees it, feel free to kind of drop that link in there for everybody else. But that profile is actually set up super well for early childhood experiences, because it's a profile that's intended for Black parents to do with their children. And essentially, the profile in and of itself is a set of guided questions that you can do with, yep, there you go. Y'all got it. Stephanie did it. So the blackgenius.com, Black Genius Planning one. And so what happens is it's basically a series of questions that a parent can take and go through with their child to ask them about the different Black genius elements. And then the idea is for that parent to present the Black genius profile to the educator. And so now the teacher can take those pieces of the Black genius elements and embed it into their instructional. Now, I'll just kind of share a brief anecdote about what happened when we did this. We were working with one teacher, and she, was getting a couple of different Black genius like profiles, and actually only had one. And what she asked me was, she was like, well, am I only going to teach to the Black genius of one of these children? And I asked her the question. I was like, well, who are you teaching to now? And she kind of looked at me with a blank stare. And really her final answer was like, nobody, right? And I think the thing that you have to really kind of think about, right, is that when you teach to nobody, what that means in America is most likely you're teaching to a white male boy. Right, because our programming is all in line with like what white male boys or white males do, right? And so anytime you're teaching to nobody, you're probably teaching to them. And so if we want to teach to anybody else, then we need to make sure that we're taking in consideration what the interest of this child is, what they think about their racial identity, who are the people that this child trusts, what do they think about social justice, and all of these different pieces. And that gives us a frame to now think about how we're going to match or personalize an instructional experience to that child. And so I saw somebody say, is this relevant for all ages? So yes, I think the Black Genius Planning tool, as it is designed, it takes a pretty creative parent, I think, to do it at 3. The closer you get to 4 and 5, the more I think you start to see like kids have like pretty explicit, like clear interest. I think you can ask any child like what they're interested in. You can do that at pretty much any age. The question is like, can you actually have a conversation with the child and them know it? I think since we have a lot of preschool educators, I'd encourage y'all to think about looking at the framework and thinking about how those questions might be adapted developmentally for the children that you're working with and the families that you're working with, if you want to use it like for 3 and younger. But I think for 4 and 5-year-olds, like you legitimately can kind of do this Black Genius Planning tool with them. Yes, and this is definitely promoting a strength-based piece, right? So like what are what are the 6 Black genius elements? We have can-do attitude, we have interest awareness, multicultural navigation, selective trust, social justice, and racial pride. And so this kind of slide just does a really simple like presentation of like the 6 different questions that you can kind of ask. So if you're like wondering high level, like what's in the Black genius profile, because there's a lot of questions in there, you can kind of see that here, right? So with can do attitude, really what we're thinking about is like, how does this child react to challenges and failure? Having a 4-year-old myself, I know that my 4-year-old reacts to challenges and failures like with a lot of like intensity and like she's just kind of like and kind of like gets very I can just feel her intensity, right? In terms of like some people I guess would call it crying and all the other stuff. And so like I've had to kind of tell her like, hey, shake it out, right? Like relax yourself, right, as you try to do this particular thing. But it's important for me to know, right, how she responds to challenges, because I could see how a teacher might interpret her passion, right, for anger, or as like a problematic behavior, right? But she just wants to know it so bad that that's all she can do. But I think that's also probably developmentally appropriate for a 4-year-old who's only been outside of somebody's womb for the last 4 years old, right? Like she just learned words a year ago. So I'm not going to expect her to be able to kind of completely emote that like I am struggling right now with the cognitive ability to grasp how to read. When I think about interest awareness, right? Like we're thinking about what the child likes to do, a very simple question of like what they'd like to do. And then the deeper question of why, I think can be really helpful and illuminating when we're thinking about how to kind of like adjust this instruction to a particular child. When we talk about multicultural navigation, we're talking about how kids move across different cultural environments and how comfortable they are in that. And there's cultural environments all over the place, right? Like a lot of times when we go to the corner store, we might be dealing with a different cultural environment than what we're dealing with at home. When we go to church, it's typically a different cultural environment. There's different cultural environments all over the place. And the idea is not for kids to necessarily get used to switching in every environment. The idea is for kids to feel comfortable in every environment, right? And to have enough respect for that particular environment that they're not being disrespectful to that particular culture, but they also kind of understand what center is. We obviously want to talk a lot about selective trust and kind of like what makes folks trust people, right? And how we create trusting environments. A lot of times with, kids, young kids, like just showing interest in what they're interested in is a way to kind of connect to that particular piece. Social justice, what's an issue that's impacting your community, right? So like, what are we thinking about when we think about what folks are connected to in terms of like the things that they're passionate about? And then racial pride, like how do they think about their Blackness, right? So again, these are really simple questions. These are really simple questions that we can necessarily ask folks. Self-regulate, that's what all protocol teachers working in classrooms. Yeah, I think I don't know what a DAP is, but I appreciate that, Sylvia. So I think we got a little bit less than 10 minutes to go. We got about 5 minutes. Developmentally appropriate practice. Thank you. So what I want y'all to think about, right, as y'all are thinking about these Black genius elements, right, is, and I'm gonna go back to this slide because we're not gonna have time to kind of go into each and every one of these, is think back to what I asked y'all at the beginning of this particular, this portion of the conversation. How was your ideal learning environment showing up in these different elements? Right. So a lot of y'all talked about like, well, I went to a different country. Well, somebody talked about I went to a different country. I would call that multicultural navigation, right? Like the ability to feel comfortable in other spaces. I saw a lot of people talking about stuff. Well, it was something that I was interested in. Well, that's definitely playing into your interest awareness. I saw a lot of people talking about like, well, it was around somebody that I trusted. That's definitely going to speak to the selective trust element. So then the question becomes, how are you creating this for the children that you're working with? And part of the way, right, to create this for the kids that you're working with, and this is the value of the Black Genius Profile and using these questions, is that you have to know the children. And right now, you have to ask yourself, do you know your kids and the families that they come from? Because what this does, this tool gives you a picture, an image, the ability to begin to access who these children are and the communities that they come from, and how you're going to incorporate that into the educational and instructional decisions that you're making in your classroom. Because if I can understand how a child reacts to failure, then I can know what that looks like in my classroom. And now maybe I don't see as a problematic behavior. And the thing that I will tell you is that a lot of times, like, yes, we know that this is a developmentally appropriate practice. Yes, we know that this is the proper way to do that. But our racial lens, again, how we see children, will have us make that particular behavior problematic. But what we do know, kind of from the racial bias literature and the things that we're looking at, is that when we call these things out, when we make them explicit, so if I make it explicit that, like, I don't have all the best verbal reactions to challenges in the environment, and I know that about that child, that humanizes that child, and it also catches our unconscious bias, right? So if it catches our unconscious bias, then it allows us to be able to kind of say, like, oh, I'm reacting to this child poorly right now, not because the child is doing anything wrong, right? This is, again, versus the fish fixing versus what I can do to create a better environment. Now I can be like, oh yeah, I know developmentally this is what I should expect. Oh yeah, I know from this child, Naya, that's how she's going to react. And so how do I help her with that, right? How do I think as a dad, that's what I'm thinking about with Salome, is like, oh, well, shake it out and be silly real quick, Salome, right? Because I don't want you to be so focused on it and so kind of gritty on this thing right now that you can't allow yourself, again, the attention to the problem. Because if I'm getting all worked up about what I'm working on, then I can't actually attend to what I'm learning. And so all of these different things are kind of helping us understand how to pay attention to and humanize the Black child. Because that's really the issue, right? Like, that's what's going on. The Black Genius Elements in the framework is we're trying to pull folks out of their unconscious mind, which is driven by white supremacy and which is driven kind of by this like idea that white is right in this country, into their conscious mind, which is, okay, I can consciously make decisions about who this child is because I know who they are and I've begun to have that conversation. And when I know a child and who they are, then I can start to be culturally affirming to that particular child. So I think I am right at time. I thought that I was going to give y'all time back, but I guess I got to talking, and that's what happens. It's right at 2:28. I'm going to kind of wrap up right there. I'll make sure that these slides that kind of have more information on like the questions and answers that we didn't get into are shared with y'all. And I'll also just kind of make sure that we share a lot of our resources. So if you go to villageofwisdom.org, what'll pop up is like, there'll be a pop-up that says like, take the pledge to protect Black genius. You take that pledge, we'll send information about all of this stuff. But also it'll also directly take you to our resource page where you can see the Black Genius profile. There's a Black Genius like profile, like handbook for parents and educators. There's all kinds of like resources and stuff like there where you would be able to kind of deepen your experience with the Black Genius profile and a lot of stuff that kind of mirrors what's on this slide deck. So I would definitely encourage folks to kind of go there. Really appreciate like being in this conversation and thankful to Ohio State for having me to kind of come and have this conversation and appreciate the energy that everybody showed in the chat box and excited to kind of continue the conversation. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much just for being with us, giving your time, and also sharing this really special expertise around the Black Genius framework for cultural affirmation. I know I personally took in a lot, and I chuckled a little bit that you thought you were going to end early, because I think we could have spent a lot more time learning from you. So thank you for that. I also just want to comment that I'm tickled by the level of audience engagement. And I think a year ago, we thought, how are we going to do all this virtual engagement with one another? And just watching this, you see that so many people who are participating have a voice to engage directly with you and with one another. And I'm finding this really powerful. So, and I also liked how you stopped periodically and commented on what people were saying. So I would like to now invite our educator panel to join us. For those who don't know, the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy here at Ohio State, we co-partner with the Schoenbaum Family Center. I'm actually standing in the Schoenbaum Family Center as we speak. We are a school for early learning. And with our partnership with Early Head Start, pretty soon we're going to be serving up to 300 kids birth to 5. So, one of the things that's really special about us is, we live in this research and advocacy world, but then we have boots on the ground every day with our amazing teachers working with families, really trying to put practices that are state of the art into place. So we have invited 3 of our teachers. Well, I guess, Latoya, you're not technically a teacher anymore. We'll never forgive you for that. But I'm going to welcome 3 of our outstanding educators. We have Ishelle Yarborough, who's a lead infant toddler teacher here, and Aliva Diaz Magarejo, how'd I do? Our lead preschool teacher here in room down the hallway. And then also Latoya Jackson, who used to be a teacher here on site and then moved into Early Head Start as an education specialist. And so, we have asked we've been doing a lot of work here around anti-bias, anti-racist practices in early education, really led by some of our panelists who are here today. And we wanted Ishelle, Aliva, and Latoya to be able to share their voices in the work that they're doing. So I'm first going to introduce you to Ishelle Yarborough. Ishelle has worked for over 18 years in home care. And how long have you been at OSU? It's been a while.
Here will be my 8th year.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Ishelle is a lead teacher and promotes diversity and representation within the classroom environment for her infants and toddlers. Ishelle earned her Child Development Associate and plans to continue her education looking at the effects of trauma and toxic stress on infants and toddlers. So I'm going to turn it over to you to have the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. It was really informative hearing you today. Thank you, Laura. So what we choose to commit to in our toddler classroom and ourselves to learning more about is equity, equality, and justice. So we know that to be actively anti-racist, it is not enough to only teach children to be kind, but that we must explicitly teach the pitfalls of racial and social disparity in our everyday classroom experiences. So since I work with an all-white children in my classroom, one action step we took was paying close attention to the print media available in our classroom. When choosing books on our shelves, we made a point to ensure that every book contains different abilities, gender expressions, or racial representation. We choose to highlight Black and Brown authors in our classroom. We typically were working with reconsidering classic books in the classroom. So typically in that classroom, we had made adjustments to use books that meet the same content goals, but show better representation of children in all their differences. So the classroom activities meet our goals of inclusion and meet Ohio's early learning development standards. So here are some examples that we have actually done in our classroom and worked with our children. Mixing paint to talk about different skin tones and using that paint and mirrors for self-portraits. Using pictures of inventions by Black and Brown creators as writing provocation. listening to stories of real Black heroes written in their own words, sharing stories orally to showcase different ways of recording history, labeling common items around the classroom in different languages, we created a Black Lives Matter and a Love is Love flag in our classroom in consistency to referencing them and their meanings. Getting to the last part, adding baby dolls with not only different skin tones and features, but different hair textures and abilities. For example, a baby doll missing an arm isn't broken, but rather is a baby with less limbs than others, but is just as valuable and deserving of being played with. Excuse me, I dry mouth. We do have honest, straightforward conversations with our toddlers about injustice to give children a basic understanding that some people receive worse treatment because of the things they cannot control, such as skin color, hair texture, gender expression, or different abilities. So with that, we know that this is an ongoing, ever-changing endeavor. We are committed to growing and learning as adults and helping this next generation obtain the tools they need to have true empathy and break cycles of generational oppression. So I do have a closing point that I want to say, which is, okay, I can't find it, but thank you.
Ishel, thank you. If you find that, we can easily circle back. So just signal, that was amazing. And I really appreciated I chuckled when you mentioned self-portraits, because I always love them when our kids make self-portraits and we put it, in years past, we've done them in glass. I don't know if we're doing glass these days. Yeah. Sorry, you're muted. Ishel, muted.
I always do that. Yeah, using the mirrors is very helpful with them to see their expressions. Of course, it's not going to be definite them, but it's them to themselves. So we like using that with the mixed paint.
Yeah.
And mirrors.
I guess glass and infant toddler rooms is not
a good thing. No.
No. So, well, thank you for that. And now I'd like to introduce Aliva Diaz Magarejo. Aliva earned her associate's degree in early childhood education in Paraguay and taught there for 3 years before coming to us in 2017. And Aliva, I'm pretty sure you've been teaching and also pursuing your bachelor's degree in HDFS, I believe, Human Development and Family Science.
Yeah.
That's a lot to take on. So welcome, Aliva. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. And thank you, Dr. Jackson, for all your remarks. It was wonderful listening to you and to you too, Ashal. So I'm really inspired and I hope I can put my ideas together too. So I do have a PowerPoint that I want to share. So you let me know if you can see this. Yes, can you see this? Okay, perfect. So, well, just the way we work in our classroom, how we implement anti-racist and anti-bias practices is we start by working around these very big concepts that one might say, but they are so present even in a preschool classroom. So the first one of them being identity. And as Dr. Jackson was mentioning, we help our children gain awareness of, at the beginning, their feelings, their thoughts, and how do they feel and what they think about any given situation. And the way we do this in our classroom is we are constantly inviting them to express themselves, asking them what they think, how they feel about any given situation, and how the children react to this, to being used to have opportunities to express themselves and to share is they naturally start sharing their interests, their ideas, particular things that they bring from their families, just, about their backgrounds, about their family culture. And then they start using this information to create this image about themselves that is positive and that they can share with their peers. And there is where our second concept comes, which is diversity. And the way we approach this is by making sure that we celebrate what each of us has to contribute in the classroom, those differences that makes us unique. That's the approach we take to differences. And this is so simple with children as to noticing that your teacher sounds different like you, even we're all talking in English, or we might all have different approaches to something that is part of the routine. Like, for example, when we're all sitting down and eating breakfast together, we make a special emphasis on noticing how do we do this different in our houses, who is part of this routinary expectation, and when we're at home, and what type of foods do we consume, and what time of the day do we have breakfast, and like noticing that even though we do the same things, we all have very particular differences that make us who we are, and they are our strengths. And this ties to the next concept that I want to talk about, which is inclusion, but inclusion from the point of addressing fair interactions, like being intentional on modeling interactions as fair. For example, we are very intentional on modeling and in addressing, exclusion or labeling or just, teasing things like interactions that are not fair, but can be corrected. And the way we do this is we include everyone into the process of correcting this, and we make a problem like this a community problem. So all of us come together, and we have town hall meetings almost every day, and this is our way of addressing any given conflict in the classroom. So every child has something to contribute, has an idea to contribute, and propose a possible solution. So at the end of our meetings, what we have is we have a set of expectations that the children created, that that meets their specific need, and in their perspective solves the problem, and is just to everyone, and is fair to everyone, and is significant because it came from them, and they're always very proud of things like that. And this ties to our next concept, which is equity, and how do we approach this big concept of equity? And we start by modeling that we can all be helpers. And this modeling being helpers is making sure the children under care know that they can seek our help and they will always be there, and making sure that we know our children, we know their interests, we know their skill levels, and we can address their needs and meet them, and give that equitable distribution of classroom resources, teacher attention, and peers attention. And the way our children respond to this is that they, after feeling empowered and supported, they start noticing peers or people around them who needs help, and they start proposing solutions, and they step up and stand up for their friends and for themselves. And all of this comes together because we take the families our families in our classroom as the experts on their children. We take their expertise as one of the most valuable resources we have, informs our practice. Every communication with our parents start with an invitation for them to share what do they think are the strategies or the tips that will best suit their children needs, and that we can implement and stand in the classroom. And when parents feel empowered to share their expertise, so then they become part of our classroom culture, and then they feel confident on seeking our help too as teachers. And so then here we come as teachers, as facilitators of all these processes coming together. So we might support with kindergarten enrollment. We might support with just the nuances of parenting a young child. But at the end of the day, all of these components move together, and we are there to facilitate this. Yeah, I think that's all that I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Aliva. When you said you have a town hall meeting almost every day, I reflected back on Dr. Jackson commenting that an aspect of culturally relevant pedagogy is having high expectations and rigor. And I was thinking town halls with 3 to 5-year-old kids is pretty rigorous. I'm impressed. So let me turn this now to our third panelist. I'm really happy to introduce you to LaToya Jackson. LaToya's been in the field of early childhood education for 11 years. She was a teacher here for 5 years in our A. Sophie Rogers School, and then moved into our more community-focused work that we do through Early Head Start, where you're an education specialist. And LaToya, this last year, our educators engaged in a book study led by Dr. Ioma Iruka and Stephanie Curenton. Had a book come out last year called Look Away, Embracing Anti-Racist Classrooms. And LaToya, I believe that you led a lot of that book study. I don't know if you're planning to share your impressions from that, but I know a lot of praise to you and your leadership on the book study. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. I am going to share some information about the book study. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint before I start talking. So let's see. Okay. So my colleague Stacey Orbaker and I led a book study using the book Don't Look Away, which is by Dr. Curenton and Dr. Ioma. And we led this with 12 early childhood educators and administrators in our program. The purpose of the book study was to challenge educators and administrators to identify and reflect on their biases, process how their biases can play a critical role in their connection with families and their teaching of children, and think of ways they could recognize and minimize biases in their classroom, school, and community. It was a very enlightening book study to do because it allowed us the opportunity to just have, conversation. Most times I feel like, we go to trainings and we kind of hear all this content and then we want to take it back into the classroom and we're like, yes, I feel empowered, but then you go back to the classroom and you kind of lose it. The point of this book study was just to continuously have a conversation about what anti-bias and anti-racism looks like in the classroom. So when we did the book study, we did have participants do a pre and post survey. And the information was, we were wanting to gather information about their racial awarenesses, their beliefs, their attitudes and teaching practices related to anti-bias, culturally responsive teaching. So at this moment, the authors and, Stacey and I are in a process of developing a white paper, and they're using the data from the pre and post survey that the participants completed. But I want to share just a few questions that we had on the post survey, pre and post survey, and kind of how they differ. So this first question, we really wanted participants to reflect on if they've implemented curriculum and instructional practices that are culturally sensitive and relevant to the students' experiences. So meaning they, intentionally spend time getting to know the child. This could be by having conversations with that child. It could be by observing that child and by having conversations with the families. So the blue portion is from the pre-survey, and the red one is from the post-survey. So you can see there are some differences. Like at first, they never kind of like engage in kind of like those intentional interactions. But then as we did the post survey, there was some difference, like it went down. So some said never, most said almost every day they were having some type of conversations, and some said weekly. So we did see some type of improvements when we did the post survey. So the next question, we were wanting participants to reflect on their engagement with families and think about how often they were seeking input from the support of their child's goals. And one thing that, now that I'm thinking about it, that we didn't take into consideration is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the connection that teachers had with parents prior to the pandemic is a lot different. They don't see them every day. A lot of the centers are still operating like someone is bringing the kids back to the classroom. So that daily connection that they were having with parents to engage in like a quick 2 to 3 minute conversation was not happening. So I really think that has impacted kind of like this survey as to why, like now, you see that even with the pre and post survey, they're checking in monthly compared to like almost daily or weekly. But I know that, and I feel just from conversations that we've had with the teachers during the book study, when they were able to engage in conversations, those were happening on a regular basis and more often because they saw them. Oops. And the last question really asks participants to reflect on the support given by their administrator when implementing anti-bias teaching practices. And something that we've learned is that this can be a very, I wouldn't say uncomfortable conversation, but not really knowing how to approach it. So trying to make sure, like, if you're really wanting to implement things in your classroom, and something like Ishel touched on is that, you know, with her classroom, she wanted to make sure there was enough print and pictures and things like that presented in the classroom. So being able to feel comfortable with, if you don't have it already, being able to go to your administrator and kind of, request those materials. So some said, never, and which those improved from the pre and post survey. And then you see some that said monthly, they felt like that they were checking in with their administrator just to make sure that they were incorporating those anti-bias, culturally responsive teaching practices. So I wanted to share the takeaways that I gained from the book study, which is, we know biases exist, but sometimes we're not aware of them. And the one thing that we realize that why we're not aware of them is because if you're constantly having conversation with people who have the same mind frame as you are, you're not really getting like a diverse, I would say, opinions and things on the matter. So sometimes it may not be comfortable to have conversations with people that don't look like you, but you gain more insight when you're having those conversations. Representation matters. Black and brown kids really need to see people that look like them in their classroom. They need to see pictures of their families. They need to see pictures of other, Black and brown people displayed in their environments. People who are Black and brown, they're like pilots, firefighters, things like that. Their environment has to be enriched in that print so then they can make that connection, because I do feel like if kids see those, those type of representations in the classroom, even with like baby dolls and things like that, they're seeing a part of themselves. So that really does help with the connection, and we're really forming a connection with the kids. And then I also feel like it will help form a connection with their families as well. And we must keep this conversation going like this. When Stacey and I started this book study, we never wanted it to be a one and done. Like, we know that we must keep having these conversations. And the reason why we created the book study is really because we wanted to create a safe space for people to come and discuss these very uncomfortable and hard topics. So we have to continue to have conversations related to anti-racism and anti-bias in education to create an equitable learning environment for children and their families. So that's something that we plan on to continue to do. We are in our second phase of the book study, so I know we'll have more data to share, but this is something that we're wanting to continue to do as long as we can. So once we have the complete white paper, we'll make sure that everyone can have access to it. So then you could kind of see some of the other questions that were asked in the survey. But yeah, that's all I had to share. Thank you.
Thank you, LaToya. And I think I saw a quick, I think Kathy might have put up a link to the guide that you developed that helped organize the book study. And so that might be a resource that can be offered. And so I think I saw that link put up. So we have a few minutes, about 7 minutes for a Q&A. There is one question here. I'll read and put it out there for all the panelists. And we invite other questions as well. So Ann Bailey actually has 2 questions. I'm going to go to number 2. In what ways, if any, would providers change their authentic assessment practices for children of color? Would anybody like to take that question on, authentic assessment practices in children of color?
I guess I'm trying to get a better understanding. So the authentic assessment practices, are you talking about the tool itself, like finding the right tool to assess children? I guess that's where my confusion lies.
Yeah, I'm glad you kind of lifted up the authentic assessment piece. and the practices that go along with capturing data. So it looks like she said yes, like the authentic assessment practice piece. I mean, I'll just say real quickly, like I think a lot of times the assessments that get validated are typically developed by folks who are kind of coming from a white Eurocentric norm. And so, yes, like it does require modification. I think oftentimes we have to think about, is this assessment actually culturally responsive? Is it allowing for a child to tap into their prior knowledge and like how they understand a particular phenomenon? Or is this assessment kind of unfairly asking questions that we wouldn't culturally assume them to be? And pretty much all the time, culture has something to do with what we're processing and learning. So yeah, I mean, it's something that you need to pay attention to. Sometimes, though, the way culture shows up in these assessments is more egregious than others. And so I think the question just becomes, yeah, how do you do that?
Let's see, it looks like, thank you. Oh, never mind. Ann Bailey says we could skip the first question. Although I will ask, I wasn't trying to imply your question was unimportant, specifically about tools like the class or Eckers. For people who are unaware, these are observational assessments that are commonly used to evaluate the quality of early learning environments. And Aliva, Ishel, Latoya, I don't know if you've used the Eckers, I think, haven't you? No, if not, yes. So the question is, do tools like that, are they associated with the learning environment? I don't know if we want to, anybody have thoughts on that? Oh, yes. Comments now, not just the assessment tool, but the rater. So the raters coming in and doing an observation of a classroom with a certain set of biases, and how does that play out in evaluating quality? Anybody want to add to that?
Yes, I think in my classroom has been a set in the class, and I'm not sure about the other one, but what I can say is that the way I see of these assessments too, it's like they're a snapshot of a moment of that's being like that's happening in my classroom, that the results don't, yes, they do show you a lot of data, but at the same time, I always remember that the community, I know my children and I know their skill levels, and the families have their knowledge and they bring that to the classroom, and we're always foundating our practice in that information, in knowing our children and establishing this relationship with their families.
Well, thank you very much. It's about 2 minutes till. Any panelists? Dr. Jackson, do you have a final closing? I have closing issues. I never pull them off very well. I'd like to say thank you for our panelists and Dr. Jackson for joining us all the way from North Carolina today. Does anybody want to make an important closing comment? I can turn it over to you. Dr. Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say real quick, I really appreciated what Ishel brought in her presentation, just around the focus explicitly on the racial identity affirmation inside of her classroom, and dealing with and handling issues of social justice. I didn't get to talk a lot about that in our Black Genius elements, but I think it's really important that we do start this conversation early. Kids, really young children, pick up on things. We know that they understand race at ages as early as 3. And so, I just really kind of impress upon people to lift up what Ishel and both Olivia talked about in terms of like, there's really practical strategies in their classrooms. And so just a salute to y'all for doing that work. I know it's not easy. I know that there's not always like a lot of resources out there. So I just want to recognize y'all for making that adaptations, for doing that stuff, and not allowing barriers to kind of get in your way of creating clean water. for your kids to swim in. So just want to say thank y'all so much for what y'all are doing and making it practical. People like me can kind of come in here and talk about all this theory all day long, but y'all are actually making it happen inside of the classrooms. And so just a salute to y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I really do want to say something in my last print of my shirt. And I touched something. I don't know what happened. I don't know if y'all saw me trying to figure out on my phone. I just turned the camera off. But I do want to show you my shirt. Things that mean a lot to me. I've been wearing a lot of them. Can you see it?
Thank you for leaving us with Ishelle, your shirt. Very important message. And also, Dr. Jackson, I'm personally going to thank you for an analogy that I think we can all hang on, and being part of cleaning the water and acting when we're seeing or participating in dirtying of the water. So thank you, everybody. And we hope to convene again, future wonderful events. So please stay connected to the Crane Center and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.